I've always been one of those people who can't resist a yard sale sign. You know the feeling. You're out running Saturday errands, see a hand-drawn poster with an arrow on a telephone pole, and decide to take a quick detour. Most of the time, you find nothing special. Just chipped teacups, old VHS tapes, and dusty board games missing half their pieces. But every once in a while, you stumble on something that feels like a real treasure. Last fall, I was running early morning errands when I spotted a yard sale in a quiet part of my town. The house was a small ranch-style home, a bit run down, with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. Still, the owners had set up a few folding tables and scattered various items on the grass. Worn quilts, old tools, kitchenware, and what looked like some antique knickknacks. Two people, a middle-aged woman and an elderly man, sat in lawn chairs, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs. I wandered through the offerings, not expecting much, until I noticed a small wooden box. It was about the size of a cigar box, carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines. The lid had a delicate brass latch. I picked it up, felt its weight, and tried to open it, but it was locked. Curious, I brought it to the elderly man and asked, "How much for this box?" He squinted at it like he hadn't noticed it before. The woman leaned over, saw what I was holding, and shrugged. $1, she said, sounding indifferent. A locked wooden box for $1 seemed like a good deal. Maybe I'd have fun prying it open, see if there was something inside. I paid, and the woman thanked me in a flat tone. I remember how neither of them tried to upsell or mention anything about the box, almost as if they wanted it gone. At home, I examined the box more closely. The patterns in the wood carving were beautiful but odd. Some leaves looked almost like twisted faces. The lock was small and old-fashioned. I tried a few small keys I had lying around, but none fit. Eventually, I used a thin screwdriver and gently forced the latch. Popped open with a soft click. Inside were a few folded pieces of yellowed paper and a tiny, dried flower. The papers were handwritten notes in old cursive. I could barely make out the words at first, but with some effort, I deciphered a name, Claire, and phrases like "forever bound," "the final promise," and something about watching from within. It felt personal, like old love letters that had taken a dark turn. I dismissed it as some antique oddity. I placed the box on a shelf in my living room, thinking it would make for an interesting conversation piece. That night, as I watched TV, I thought I heard something from that corner of the room. A faint scraping sound, almost like fingernails against wood. I paused the show, listened, and heard nothing else. I chalked it up to my imagination. A few days later, I came home from work and noticed the box was slightly ajar. The lid lifted by about an inch. I could have sworn I had closed it fully. I locked it again, making sure the latch caught. The next morning, it was open once more. This time, the dried flower was gone. I searched the shelf, the floor, even checked if it got stuck in the lid's hinge, but it vanished. As the week went on, I became increasingly uneasy. Once, late at night, I heard whispering, very faint, like a distant radio. I followed the sound to the living room. The TV was off, the windows closed. When I turned on the lamp, I found the box open again. The notes inside were rearranged, as though someone had been leafing through them. I told myself maybe I hadn't been careful, maybe I left it unlocked. But deep down, I knew something was off. I decided to put the box in a drawer, out of sight, out of mind. A few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange tapping sound. It seemed to come from my bedroom closet. Heart pounding, I got up, turned on the light, and opened the closet door. Sitting right there on a shelf above my clothes was the box. Lid open, those old notes splayed out. The drawer I'd locked it in was in another room entirely. My hands shook as I placed the box back in the drawer, this time adding a rubber band around it and placing a heavy book on top. I tried to sleep but couldn't. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I needed to figure this out. I drove back to that neighborhood and found the house where I'd bought the box. The yard sale was long gone, and the house looked empty. curtains drawn, no car in the driveway. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. An older neighbor watering her garden next door eyed me suspiciously. When I asked if she knew the owners, she said they'd moved out right after the sale. Struck me as odd. I asked if she remembered anything about them. She frowned and said something like, "They were quiet people. The old man had recently lost his wife, I think." I thanked her and left, feeling no closer to understanding. Back at home, I read the notes more carefully. They mentioned a person named Claire who had passed away unexpectedly. The writer seemed desperate, calling upon forces or spirits to bind Claire's essence to the vessel. The last line said, "This shall be our final promise, never to part again." It sounded like some grieving person's attempt to trap a loved one's spirit. That night, I tried to sleep with the box still in the drawer. Around midnight, the power went out. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert, some transformer issue. In the dark silence, I heard soft crying. It came from the hallway. Grabbing a flashlight, I opened the drawer. The box lay there, undisturbed. I locked the bedroom door and tried to calm down. Then, a gentle thump at the door. I froze. Another thump, then a whisper, "Please, let me in." The voice was thin, sorrowful. I wanted to scream, but I stayed silent. Eventually, the sounds faded. I must have drifted off, clutching my flashlight, too exhausted to think straight. At dawn, I decided to get rid of the box. I took it to a remote area off a dirt road outside of town, dug a hole and buried it deep. I felt relief as I covered it with soil. I told myself that whatever it was, some haunted heirloom, a cursed object, was now gone from my life. For a few days, everything was normal. No strange noises, no doors opening. I began to relax, convinced I'd done the right thing. But one evening, as I sat at my desk checking emails, I heard a familiar soft click behind me. My heart lurched. Turning slowly, I saw it. The wooden box sitting on my windowsill, lid slightly open. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, got in my car, and drove several towns over, tossing it into a dumpster behind an abandoned strip mall. I watched as a garbage truck in the lot next door was picking up other bins, confident it would be carted off soon. I left feeling shaken but determined. But when I got home, my front door was ajar. Inside, on the kitchen counter, lay the box. Open. Empty. The notes and dried flowers scattered on the floor. I screamed in frustration. Who was doing this? I gathered everything, poured lighter fluid on the box and its contents, and set it on fire in my backyard fire pit. The flames danced high, turning the old paper and wood into ash. Smoke rose into the sky, carrying whatever presence it held far away. I stayed until it was all gone, no embers left. Since that night, I haven't seen the box again, but I still have nightmares about it. Sometimes I dream I'm holding it, and the lid creaks open by itself, showing nothing inside but endless darkness. Sometimes I wake up sure I heard a soft whisper in my ear. I don't know who Claire was or what that desperate person tried to do. All I know is that I brought something into my home that was never meant to be found. Now, when I see a yard sale sign, I still get curious, but I think twice. Some things should remain buried, locked away, or burned to ash. You never know what secrets an old wooden box might carry. I've never been into big, flashy antiques. I prefer practical bargains, kitchen utensils, lawn equipment, maybe some old vinyl records. It's less about collecting and more about saving money and enjoying a piece of history. So when I found a yard sale boasting professional chef supplies just outside the city, I couldn't resist stopping by. I had recently moved into a new apartment and needed good knives and cookware. It was a crisp Saturday morning. The yard sale was at a large suburban home, nicer than my usual stops. The driveway was lined with stainless steel pots, cast iron pans, and professional-grade knives in wooden blocks. The seller, a woman in her early 40s, smiled broadly as I admired the selection. She told me her late husband had been a chef, and she was downsizing now that he was gone. "My condolences," I said, and she nodded with a sad smile. A particular knife caught my eye. A chef's knife with a carved wooden handle and a slightly curved blade. It looked old, well-maintained, and balanced perfectly in my hand. The blade carried a faint engraving of initials, MW. I asked the price. She hesitated, then said $20 for the knife and a wooden cutting board that came with it. Felt like a steal. I thanked her, paid up, and left with my new prize. At home, I washed the knife carefully and set it on the cutting board. Over the next few days, I used it to chop vegetables and meats, enjoying how smoothly it cut through everything. There was something satisfying about using a tool that felt expertly crafted. But I started noticing odd things. After using the knife and cleaning it, I'd return later to find it slightly moved on the countertop. Once, I found a drop of what looked like blood on the cutting board, though I hadn't cut myself. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I had nicked a finger and not noticed. A week later, I woke up around midnight to a strange sound in my kitchen, like a soft thud. Nervously, I crept out of bed and flicked on the kitchen light. The knife lay in the sink, blade angled against a pot. I was sure I'd left it on the counter. Did it fall? But from where? The next morning, I decided to check the cutting board more carefully. Flipping it over, I noticed faint scratches on the underside, shapes that might have been letters or symbols. It was too faint to make sense of, so I ignored it. Another few days passed quietly, but one evening, I invited a couple of friends over for dinner. While prepping a meal, I accidentally cut myself, just a small nick on my thumb. Nothing serious. I washed it, applied a Band-Aid, and kept going. That night, I swear I heard whispering in my kitchen. At first, I thought it was the neighbor's TV muffled through the wall, but the sound was too close, right outside my bedroom door. Heart pounding, I opened the door and crept into the hallway. The whispering stopped. Everything was still. I checked the kitchen. The knife lay on the cutting board, exactly as I left it. This pattern repeated over the next weeks. Small, strange occurrences, barely enough to justify worry. The knife moving a few inches, a faint metallic smell in the kitchen, the sound of something tapping against the cutting board at odd hours. I started to feel jumpy, questioning my own sanity. To reassure myself, I installed a cheap camera in the kitchen. If something weird was happening, I wanted proof. The first night I recorded, nothing happened. The second night, same. By the third night, I was almost disappointed. But the fourth night, I woke to that soft tapping sound again. The next morning, I checked the footage. Most of it showed just an empty kitchen. But around 2:37 a.m., I saw the knife, without anyone touching it, slide slowly across the cutting board. It moved about 2 inches, then stopped. The camera's audio picked up a faint scraping. My blood ran cold. I replayed it multiple times, convinced I had to be mistaken. There were no strings, no one entering the room. The knife moved on its own. I considered throwing it out, but I'd grown both afraid and fascinated. I wanted to understand what was happening. Maybe the knife was haunted, if that was even possible. Or maybe the cutting board had something to do with it. I remembered the faint scratches and decided to sand the underside to see if I could reveal the pattern. Using fine sandpaper, I carefully removed a thin layer of wood, slowly revealing carved letters. They formed words. M. Willard, blood for craft. My stomach twisted. Was MW for M. Willard? And what did blood for craft mean? I searched online for the name and found references to a local chef who went missing decades ago. Some rumors said he'd been involved in strange rituals, sacrificing animals to improve his culinary magic. It sounded like an urban legend. Could this knife and board have belonged to him? The more I thought about it, the more I wanted to get rid of the knife. But fear and curiosity wrestled in my mind. Maybe I could return it to the woman I bought it from. When I drove back to that house, it looked empty. A for sale sign stood on the lawn. The neighbors said she'd moved out abruptly. They had no forwarding address. That night, I attempted a different approach. I placed the knife and board in the center of my kitchen floor and spoke aloud, feeling ridiculous. Whoever you are, I'm sorry I have your knife. I don't want trouble. I can return it or destroy it. The silence that followed was oppressive. I tried sleeping, But at around 3 a.m., a loud crash jolted me awake. I ran to the kitchen. The knife and board were gone. After a frantic search, I found them in the living room, propped against the TV stand. The knife's blade glinted even in the dim light. Another drop of blood marked the floor, though I hadn't cut myself. I wiped it up with trembling hands. I decided enough was enough. I took the knife and board outside, threw them into a metal bucket, and poured lighter fluid over them. I sparked a match. The fire roared up, illuminating my small backyard. The knife's wooden handle and board caught flame easily. As I watched them burn, I felt a sense of relief. Once they were nothing but charred remains, I doused it with water and went inside. The next morning, I checked the ashes. The handle and board were gone, just black flakes. But the blade, though warped by heat, remained. I wrapped it in newspaper and tossed it into a dumpster a few blocks away. I wasn't taking any chances leaving it at my place. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I'd glance at the kitchen and imagine the knife still sitting there. But no new incidents occurred. My nights were quiet again, and I started to believe I'd freed myself from whatever presence clung to that old tool. A month later, I was strolling through another yard sale, cautious now, more than ever, when I spotted something that made me freeze. Among kitchen utensils, an old cutting board with faint carving patterns. I leaned in and sure enough, saw faint letters resembling those I'd sanded off mine. W-I-L. My heart hammered. I walked away immediately, not wanting to tempt fate again. I can't explain what happened with that knife and cutting board. All I know is that I brought something into my home tied to dark intentions, a history of blood and desperate rituals. Now, when I look at kitchenware at a yard sale, I keep my distance. Some bargains come with too high a price. When I was younger, my mother used to drag me to yard sales every weekend. I hated it then, but as an adult, I started to appreciate it. There's a certain thrill in sifting through other people's cast-offs, hoping to find something unique or valuable. Over the years, I picked up a habit of looking for unusual art pieces. Not expensive, just strange. Amateur paintings, odd sculptures, handcrafted figurines. They added character to my apartment. One sunny morning, I stopped at a yard sale in a part of town known for its eclectic residents. A woman with long gray hair and a flowing dress greeted me warmly. Her yard was full of color. Tie-dye blankets, wind chimes, dream catchers, and quirky art. My eye caught a small statue carved from what looked like driftwood. It depicted a figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, standing on a tiny base carved with symbols. I couldn't read the symbols, but they looked tribal. "How much for this piece?" I asked, holding up the statue. The woman hesitated, looking genuinely sad. "That one belonged to my late brother. He was a traveler, collected oddities from around the world. Honestly, I'd let it go for $5. Just treat it with respect, okay?" I laughed lightly and agreed, not thinking much of it. Back home, I placed the statue on a shelf above my computer desk. His hollow eyes made me uneasy if I looked too long, but I shrugged it off as just a creepy aesthetic. Over the next few days, I noticed a strange pattern. Whenever I sat at my desk, I felt like someone was standing behind me. I turn around, and of course, see no one but that statue. The feeling was subtle at first, just a prickling on my neck. Then my dreams turned odd. I dreamt I was walking through a dense forest at night, hearing soft chanting in a language I didn't understand. The chanting always led me to a clearing where a figure with hollow eyes stood, raising its arms to the sky. I'd wake up in a sweat, heart racing. After a few nights of this recurring dream, I started to blame the statue. It was too big a coincidence. I moved the statue to the living room, hoping out of sight would mean out of mind. But the dreams persisted, and now I woke to find small disturbances around the house. Furniture slightly shifted, a door I'd closed now open. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd left it ajar. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Still, an unease settled in my gut. One afternoon, I invited a friend over. I wanted a second opinion. He noticed the statue and said, half joking, "Dude, that's creepy as hell. Looks like something from a horror movie. I didn't tell him about the dreams or the strange feelings, just nodded. But when he left, he texted me later that night. "Hey, I keep thinking about that statue. It gave me a weird vibe. This unsolicited confession worried me." Desperate for answers, I examined the statue closely with a magnifying glass. The symbols on the base weren't just random scratches. They formed a pattern of intertwined shapes. I tried searching online for tribal carvings, but nothing matched. I considered asking the woman who sold it to me, but when I returned to that street, I found no sign of her. The house looked vacant, a for rent sign on the lawn. The next week, things escalated. I started hearing noises at night, soft footfalls in the hallway, the faint rustle of fabric. Twice, I woke to find the statue not on the shelf but on my coffee table, angled toward me as though watching. I locked it in a closet. The next morning, I found it on my bedside table. That's when I knew I had to get rid of it. I wrapped the statue in a towel, put it in a box, and drove it to a thrift store donation drop-off. I figured letting it slip back into circulation was a bad idea, but I couldn't just leave it on the street. At least this way, it might find a new home far from me. But as I walked back to my car, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across my path. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. No dreams, no noises. It was bliss. For 2 whole days, everything felt normal. On the 3rd day, I returned from work and found the statue on my kitchen counter. Same hollow eyes, same carved symbols. I nearly dropped my keys in shock. How did it get back? Panicked, I searched my apartment for signs of a break-in. Nothing. Windows locked, no footprints. Just that cursed statue back in my home. My hands shook as I picked it up and examined it for a hidden tracker or some trick. Nothing. Just wood and strange carvings. I decided to destroy it. I took it to the basement of my building where we had a small workshop area. Using a hammer and chisel, I attempted to break it apart. The wood was unnaturally hard. With each strike, a strange echo filled the room. Finally, the wood cracked. As I pried it open, I found a small hollow cavity inside. Inside that cavity was a tiny bundle of dried herbs and a fragment of bone. My stomach turned. What had I brought into my home? Some ritual object? I crushed the herbs, snapped the bone fragment, and burned everything in a metal pan. The smoke smelled foul, making my eyes water. Then I smashed the statue into splinters and tossed them into a garbage bag. I took the bag out to a distant dumpster at a construction site, sure no one would dig through that mess. Exhausted, I returned home, hoping this was finally over. No statue, no herbs, no bone. I double-checked the locks. Everything secure. That night, I had no dreams. I woke feeling relieved. But the next evening, as I watched TV, a tapping noise came from my balcony window. I live on the 3rd floor, so it couldn't be someone knocking. Cautiously, I pulled back the curtain. Nothing outside but darkness and distant city lights. Yet, when I turned around, my living room felt colder. The hairs on my neck stood up. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I spun around the room, searching every corner. The statue wasn't there, it couldn't be. I destroyed it, but I realized something terrible. Maybe destroying the statue wasn't the end. If the object was some kind of vessel, breaking it might have released whatever was inside. Now I had no control over it. At least before, it seemed tied to that piece of wood. For the next few nights, I hardly slept. Doors would open by themselves. Lights flickered. My phone died inexplicably even after charging. Whispers followed me from room to room. One night, I woke to see a faint silhouette standing at the foot of my bed, hollow-eyed and thin-limbed like the statue, but now freestanding and translucent. I screamed, and it vanished as soon as I turned on the lamp. I tried contacting the woman who sold it to me, but the address was fake, and no one in the neighborhood knew her. I was alone with this curse. I considered moving, but something told me it wouldn't help. It would follow me wherever I went. Desperate, I visited a local bookstore rumored to carry occult texts. I explained my situation vaguely to the owner, an elderly man with intense eyes. He listened quietly and then advised me to perform a simple banishing ritual, cleansing my apartment with salt water, burning sage, and repeating words of dismissal. I felt silly, but I had nothing to lose. That night, I followed his instructions. I sprinkled salt water at every door and window, burned sage until my eyes stung, and chanted phrases he'd written down for me. At first, nothing happened, but after I made a full circuit of my apartment, I felt a shift in the air. It was lighter, less oppressive. I collapsed on the couch, exhausted. The following morning, I woke up feeling rested, something I hadn't felt in weeks. My apartment was quiet, peaceful. Over the next several days, no strange noises, no dreams, no whispering. It seemed like the presence had finally departed. It's been months now, and I haven't experienced anything abnormal since. I still think about that statue sometimes, how a simple yard sale purchase led me into something I couldn't understand. I wonder who made it and what the symbols meant. I wonder if the woman who sold it to me knew what she was passing on. Maybe she did, and that's why she seemed sad. One thing's certain, I've become a lot more careful about what I buy at yard sales. Quirky art might seem harmless, but you never know what history it carries, what hidden forces are tied to it. Next time I see a strange figurine, I'll keep walking. Some mysteries aren't worth inviting into your home.